Welcome to Studio Visits with Zora J, where I get to talk in depth with some of the most interesting contemporary photographers working today about their latest projects. I'm David Oresick, the Executive Director of Zora J Center for Photography. Zora J works to promote the power of contemporary photography as a fine art medium by creating original exhibitions, unique educational programming like this series, and through the lab at Zora J, a space for artists in our community to learn, create, and connect. This week, I spoke with Zora J. Murff about his newest book, At No Point in Between, published by Deus Books in 2019. Murff is an assistant professor of art at the University of Arkansas. He received his MFA in studio art from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he began to work on the series that became At No Point in Between. Murff uses photography as a way to explore the histories of American systems and the role imagery plays in shaping our beliefs and perceptions. I've watched these pictures develop from afar for a few years, and I've been so impressed with his work, so I was really excited to get in the weeds with Zora about his influences, his inspirations, and what he looks for in a good photo book edit. I was also really moved by how he was able to open up about his process, and especially to hear him speak about the existential crisis he was feeling that led him to begin this work. A few copies of At No Point in Between are still available for purchase at deusbooks.net, and I really hope you'll check it out because I think this conversation will be a lot more resonant if you can spend some time with the publication. And now my conversation with Zora J. Murff. I'm really excited to talk to you today. We've had you in the gallery with a conversation about a year or two ago with Terrence Washington, where you two discussed this work in a much earlier stage. But I'm really excited to talk to you about this book now that it's come out. It was published by Deus Books last year, and I think it's one of the most beautiful, richest, most complicated photo books that I've seen in a long time, and it's got a lot of layers that I can't wait to dig into them with you. I have so many questions, but I think to start off, I want to ask you, how did you get started on this book called At No Point in Between?
Oh man. Well, first of all, thanks, David, for such a generous, generous introduction to the work. And it's good to be in conversation with you, and kind of working with. The project started when I was a graduate student at the University of Nebraska. Yeah, I started it. Started shooting, like making pictures in North Omaha as a graduate student. Doing a lot of research about the history of that place. I think it was like a matter of just really reflecting deeply on, sort of like my my own being, at that time, at the time in my life, um, and making these really sort of crucial connections between, maybe experiences that I was having, like these kind of existential questions I was asking myself, and then, like learning about this one neighborhood, and like all of this sort of violence and oppression, that kind of formed it into the place that it was. This beautiful, rich place. Where all of,
Well, if I can back you up a second, I mean,
yeah.
what what were those questions you were asking about yourself in relation to this place?
So it was, like this moment in history, like where we were, like cameras were capturing, Black individuals being killed by police officers. Like I decided to watch the footage of the murder of Laquan McDonald when it was released, and that was the first time that I had like decided I was going to like watch it all the way through. I became like, after doing that, I became rather obsessed with, um, the trial, of the officer Jason Van Dyke. But I think I became so obsessive because I got so wrapped up in like wanting to understand, you know, like you know, like what does justice sort of look like in this situation, um, and then like how does that relate to my own being, this kid was perceived as dangerous, because of his physical appearance. And I think it was like just this moment, like where I couldn't escape it. Like I had to ask myself, like kind of,
Mm-hmm.
how do I move through this world? How do people see me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are my behaviors read? And then just kind of thinking about the necessity of the question itself, right? And that was like, I guess where I was at, like, you know, like asking myself these questions, and then at the same time, deciding to go back to school to study art.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that trauma and that pain is present in the work, that your mind is in that place, and it comes through in a couple different ways. But I think before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, tell me about North Omaha. What do people who are looking at this book need to understand about that place?
I mean, I think that, to me, I'm not really, I don't know, like, if I would say I'm asking people to recognize any aspect about it in particular, other than that it's a real place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that it has this history of redlining, um, and how, like, like, I guess, like, that sort of the reality of the neighborhood, it's past, and how that past kind of relates to the present. That the story of it is ubiquitous, across neighborhoods, throughout the United States.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's like, I think we have to grapple with the fact that these spaces exist everywhere.
I think that's a really interesting answer to the question, because when I'm looking at this project, I see in some ways a really specific place and a moment in time and people who are clearly individuals living in this neighborhood who are specific people. And I also see maybe a more symbolic layer, but a lot of these photographs seem to represent things beyond the project. Thinking a little bit of photographs like the cut down tree. Am I right? There's kind of a balance between a specificity and a more general symbolism happening in a lot of these photographs.
Definitely. And I think that was the making, right? Like that, like, when I started going and photographing in North Omaha, and I was learning about redlining, and like learning about it as this invisible process, or this process that was designed to be invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these, like, kind of markers or signifiers, in the landscape, structures that exist, like there's these things, like these sort of kind of visual cues, right? And so it's like it was a process of kind of teasing out those aspects, but then doing it in a way that did that, like, to me, I guess, was like, trying to transcend sort of categorization.
You know, when you've mentioned the process of understanding redlining became important in forming this work. Um, One, could you maybe define exactly what redlining is? Because I think that was a word I had definitely heard before in reference to certain communities, and usually lower income communities or communities of color. But I didn't really understand what it meant. And two, how do you photograph that?
Sure. Yeah, it was, so, like, redlining, it's the denial of services, or sort of like the restricting of services. And it's done through, like, I guess, just predatory practices, like in lending. The federal government, in the 30s, sent, or had, like, contracted assessors to, map metropolitan areas, and then figure out what the value of land was. And so the government created these underwriting manuals to help those assessors kind of determine how to make the maps, and then how to mark off sections of land. And then, and within that, there became, like, this sort of rating, this value system, um, and that was categorized by, like, alphabetically A, B, C, D. And so A, of course, being prime, D being substandard. And so like one way that they would determine value of land was by the makeup of like racial occupancy. And so if an area was majority Black, it was given a lesser value. And so what that means is that lending organizations, banks, if someone's coming in and saying, I want to secure a business loan and I want to put it in this D-rated neighborhood, the bank's going to be like, well, maybe we don't want to lend money to you because, this area is kind of poor, the value's down. We don't want to, like, it's a risk for us to give you money here. It forces investment in other areas that are deemed more value. Inherently, those are areas occupied by white individuals, right?
And it gives the lender a kind of cover, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they can
Exactly.
say, we're not being racist. This is just the manual the federal
Mm-hmm.
government gave us. It's not
Exactly.
our decision, or it's not our
Right.
fault.
Exactly. And so that creates, like, it doesn't initially create the system, right? It just creates the perfect setup for the system to then start running, right? It's just a way to fuel up the machine in a sense. People lose their jobs, they can't invest in their communities anymore. Businesses leave because they don't have patronage. Like all of that stuff happens. The economic state of the community essentially crumbles. And then, in come the things, poverty, drug use, crime, all of those things that then, like rather than looking at the system, how the system was set up to create these failures, blaming the individuals who were victims of that system and like saying that it's their problem, like they created it. And then like, yeah, like it was designed to be invisible. Its effects aren't immediate. They take place over huge periods of time. And so then all I can do in that moment as a photographer is like look at the state of things as they are now, and then try to tease out like sort of this information that seems to be invisible until it's activated, sort of in my sort of practice, how I look at it.
Is there maybe a photograph that you can point to that kind of illustrates that, making the invisible visible?
The image of the freeway. I mean, that's like maybe a good place to start. That was like sort of a moment, like a groundbreaking moment for me in the work was thinking about the freeway system and then how that system was used, and then how it works in the history of redlining and its sort of commonality. So the freeway that runs through North Omaha, it was originally supposed to be built through a majority white neighborhood, but then those individuals, use their political capital to have it be built through the Black neighborhood. And so, it of course, was like, I think it was like maybe 3-4 like city blocks wide, but it destroyed tons of homes, displaced a bunch of people. And so you have like this kind of fracturing of a community in that sense. But then what it also does is diverts traffic from the main business corridor of North Omaha, which was like how you traveled north and south. And so, like once that traffic is diverted, then people stop patronizing, like they stop going to the businesses there.
I was just going to say, I think in this photograph in particular was one that
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about, because it shows the freeway not just as something that's doing all the things you're describing. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
wall. It's a dead end at the end of
Mm-hmm.
this corridor through these apartments.
Definitely. Well, and it's like, just the ways of like speaking to boundary visually, I think was like something I was considering with this image. When I took this one, like that specific photograph, like I was like, okay, this is how you get there. Like this is the image that, yes, it shows like the thing itself, but then alludes to the larger idea, like sort of like showing like how it was like specifically designed to operate.
I think so. There's a photograph called Courts towards the beginning of
Mm-hmm.
the book,
Mm-hmm.
that has been one that I've been looking at a lot, and it's this kind of gorgeous, enormous like tree that just fills the frame, with that chain link fence and the basketball court and the kind of telephone wires running through the frame. And I began to see this as almost like this tree, must be at least 100 years old and must have kind of been a part of all this history and this kind of overgrown scene, and the way I saw this as a kind of a metaphor for the way that history, is present in the project, and there are these elements that have seen these changes over time. Is that an accurate reading at all, or tell me about this photograph?
I remember making this photograph, but I was like the space, like it had almost like this, I don't know, like sacred or like spiritual feel.
Hmm.
And then yeah, like that massive tree, like actually some of the branches had started to like grow like over the fence and like into the court.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I was just like, I was kind of like marveling at like, kind of just the scene itself. And then yeah, like considering like the larger like history and like just time and like how the space, like how time, maybe how time fills the space is a good way of putting it.
I wanted to ask you about your portraits. And I think
Mhm.
to me, the kind of beating heart of this book is the kind of portraits sequence throughout. And just what is your, how did you go about making these? And what is your kind of, what role do you see the portraits playing in the book?
Mhm. I think, to me, the portraits kind of stand like to me, they're this idea of, I guess, love. And it's something that my friend Lisa, write, who wrote the afterword for the book, it's something that she responds to. And she says, I think it's what I want to like say what I see as beauty, but what I think I mean by beauty is love.
Mm.
Um, and I was when she wrote that, like it took like it was one of those things that I read and I was like, oh yeah, that's really nice. And then like actually I was like, oh wait, actually I think this is more important of a moment that I'm giving it, right? And thinking about, yeah, like, what was I kind of thinking about when I photograph people? It relates back to, watching that Laquan McDonald being murdered. Like I talk about the work, I talk about that moment a lot, and that it was a fearful moment. And then thinking about fear, not only thinking about harm, but also thinking about, the ways in which I learned fear, and learning fear from my mom. And that
Mhm.
she wanted to teach me that fear because it's a necessity for me as a Black individual, but that she's teaching me that because she loves me. And, so I'm learning about myself. I'm learning, and as I gain that deeper understanding, I begin to love myself even more, despite like what the world is telling me, the value of my existence is in this country. Or like the moment for me is what's important, like this moment where I see this stranger, the stranger sees me, and we like, throughout like through our brief interaction, we get a deep sense of I don't know, like of who of like who we are, and like how and the ways in which we're connected, and this idea of like, I guess being acknowledged.
I think the portraits, and I think the reason the portraits stand out as being so much the driving kind of force behind this book for me is, if there is a moment of hope, it's in the portraits. If there is a moment of love, it's in the portraits. If there is a kind of unadulterated, kind of pure beauty and reverence, I think these portraits are about as close to that as I've ever seen. I mean, the connection feels so palpable to me between the photographer and your sitters. I was thinking about when I was studying with Dawood Bey, and if I can try to summarize Dawood's theory of portraiture, he would often talk about the importance of portraying ordinary people with dignity and love and respect in a picture, especially people who hadn't been seen that way, in art history, in the media, in a popular context, and that making a picture with a genuine kind of reverence for your subject was a radical and important gesture.
To me, it was. like it seems like such that idea, and I guess like, yeah, how you're putting it, like it seems like such a simple gesture, right? And I think that was like something like I had this like kind of moment where it was like, oh, like that's that in itself is enough, right? Like that act in itself is enough. um
Hmm. Maybe to transition to the other element this book brings to bear is a variety of found images, um, which are some of the most kind of haunting and I think traumatizing parts of the book, which you've incorporated a lot of found images from kind of famous and infamous moments of police violence against young black men, basically. But you show these images in a very specific way, where the images in themselves do not show the violence. They're oftentimes the moments before. And there's also at least one sort of historical lynching photograph as well that also kind of crops out and omits the violence. Tell me about the process of bringing in this kind of found imagery and archival imagery into the book, and why you wanted to contrast with the kind of contemporary scene of a neighborhood that you've made.
yeah, well, I think it kind of goes back to like, kind of conceptualizing the work through the landscape of North Omaha itself,
Hmm.
like thinking about like again like how do you make visible something that is designed to be invisible. So thinking about this profound experience that I'm having, kind of questioning my own existence, being prompted by a video or a sequence of still images, thinking about like thinking about myself as an image maker, and then also just like this act of collecting. So I collect images like vernacular like photography of Black individuals, and it's like this thing I just like it's this process of like reclaiming for me. And so like I'm thinking about photography in all of these different ways, and so the archived images like they exist as like this form of evidence like that these things did happen, but then like to me again it's like about kind of getting into like the subtle things of the images. So the lynching photograph, for instance, the real image, like the real image of it is pretty tragic. It shows, Will Brown's body in the front of the frame. It's pretty graphic, a pretty graphic image. And so what I noticed was when I first encountered that image, I was so caught up in the moment of violence itself. Like that's where my eyes were kind of glued. And I was thinking about the victim. And of course, yes, I do need to acknowledge, his existence and, his story and, the like really tragic way that his life ended. But I can't just stop looking there. One of the most important aspects of this photograph to me is this crowd of white men who could put themselves so solidly, to create a piece of tangible evidence to say I was here and I was complicit in this act, and I can do this, in this country with impunity. To me, that's the more important part of the photograph. That's the part that like we really need to look at critically and kind of rectify with. And like, how does that relate to images that we see today? Just this act of kind of cropping into that image and
Mhm.
forcing the viewer's gaze to that moment, kind of where I began to do like this sort of like it's almost like sampling in music, I would say. Like
Mhm.
it's like this kind of taking like borrowing like from historic record and then kind of remixing it, and kind of showing it like finding a new use for it, or like a use for it that's already existed but then like kind of putting this spin on it.
What about sort of some of the other found images from more
Mhm.
contemporary sources?
So there's an image of a group of police officers being sworn in, but thinking
Hmm.
about like this idea of policing, like police violence, but then the act of policing in general, like how the neighborhood I was in was policed versus, like, majority white neighborhoods. There's like a marked difference there. And this image was on the front page of the paper one day, and I was just like, well, I was like blown away by finding it. Just this sort of like this act of this group of officers like raising their hand and thinking about this moment and like what they're signing up for, and then thinking about like this idea of numbers. And to me like I'm looking at this image asking like which one of you might murder somebody who looks like me.
Mm.
Like that's like a real question that I have about this photograph. And then so I, took it and put it in the context of the work. And so in the book, you encounter that image, or you encounter this building facade, then this traffic sign with the don't walk sign. So you have like this hand, and then you get to the next page, and it's this image of these officers being sworn in, all kind of echoing that like don't walk, the hand. And so you make that crucial connection. And then the next page is a portrait of this individual I photographed named Jaleesa. And then I think the next page is a piece of text that says Vivian was. And so that it was like this kind of connection to this story that exists in North Omaha, the story that happened in North Omaha of this young girl, Vivian Strong, who was 14, and she was shot in the back of the head by a police officer that she was running away from, and he was acquitted of the crime. And then so you get to that text, you get to Jaleesa's portrait, which is kind of this echoing of this found image of Vivian Strong that appears elsewhere in the book. You get to the text Vivian was, this idea of like text, and then kind of place at the bottom of the page, and so implying that an image should be there, but the image is gone. And then you get to the following page, and it's a still from the moment right before Laquan McDonald encounters Officer Jason Van Dyke, and then how that story from the present day connects back to this police murder from 1969. And so I can connect, those two moments in time. I can connect it to the landscape of North Omaha and the process of redlining. And so like this sort of like, I guess, like intersectional kind of thinking in the book, this sort of intersectional logic existing again through this context of sequence of how things unfold in like this linear sort of fashion. Like that's how I'm kind of using everything to kind of to have like each type of image question the other types, and hopefully the viewer can begin to kind of make those connections as well.
That story, and I think that sequence is so powerful. And I think the thing that stands out to me about it is that there's a kind of it's almost kind of unstuck in time, in the way that this place, all these events are kind of swirling, and past and present are mixed up. And especially starting off with the lynching photograph, which is 100 years ago. I think the relationship to time is one that, again, I think we've been talking about in a couple of different ways. One phrase that's used in Lisa Svill's essay is this idea of a violence being slow.
Mm-hmm.
Was that an idea that came from you, or how did that kind of come to figure into the project? This notion of slow violence.
Yeah, actually, it's an idea that exists, and so the term was coined by a sociologist named Rob Nixon. It comes from a book that he did, Slow Violence, Gender, and the Environmentalism of the Poor. But he's talking about like this idea of like what qualifies as violence, and basically like violence exists in these multiple ways, and that we need to begin like thinking about like environmental issues, things like redlining. We need to be thinking about those as forms of violence. And so he is just positing like this sort of difference between like the ways in which we perceive it. So we perceive it either as fast violence, so that's like the violence we know, where risk and harm is present. And then you have slow violence, so this type of violence that isn't seen. And the reason that we don't see it is because there are vast gaps between cause and effect. So if you think about, like the economic state of North Omaha at the time that I was photographing it, those effects, like the causes, the root causes started in the 1930s. And I was photographing in the neighborhood, like starting in, I think, like 2015, 2016, around there. And so like I was seeing the effects, but I could only speak to the cause in like this sort of theoretic sense, or like finding, like doing like this academic research, right? And I guess even like, I guess you could have like, you started to like see a lot of these things manifest, I think, probably around the time like the freeways were getting built.
I wanted to ask you about the Lisa Seville essay at the end of the book, and it's a really
Mhm,
beautiful essay, and I love this idea about, you know, where you prompted her. You said write around the work, not about the work, and in a way, I think that mirrors what the work does, right? Because you're not one to come out and say exactly what you're thinking in your projects, right? There's poetry
mhm,
and metaphor, and they are, you know, you're coming around a lot of ideas about the depictions of people and places and systems, and they kind of add up to more than the sum of their parts, I think,
mhm,
through your editing. I just want to read that passage that
mhm,
gets to an idea that I found to almost sum up the project in a really interesting way for me, or at least to sum up a big part of it. She writes, "Don't write about the work, you tell me, write around it. In another beginning, there was another boy. He was born in bondage and died a free man. At some point in between, he saw the light and chemistry not only captured an image, but conjured a world. He turned himself into the most photographed man in what were not yet and may never be these United States. Frederick Douglass believed that a certain kind of picture could twist the story that is this country had whispered itself to sleep with. So he dressed up and pressed up against the hypocrisy, and he said, Behold. Even as he sat to have his picture made, he saw that it would be subject to what he called the wild scramble between contending interests and forces. It will either lift us to the highest heavens or sink us to the bottomless depths, he wrote, understanding perhaps before anyone else did that this country would war over the photograph much as it battled over itself. I think that passage about Frederick Douglass really beautifully sums up so much of what you're saying in this project, that the battle over the meaning of images is going to rage on. It's not going to be settled anytime soon. Do you believe that photographing someone with humanity, you know, and featuring their humanity in a photograph can be some part of changing our situation?
mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that like I always have a difficult time sort of like saying like what my photographs can do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you know, it's like I say that I believe in the work's potential. And I
Mm-hmm.
think maybe potential to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think, you know, like kind of going back to like the Douglas image or, you know, kind of referencing his use of photography, you know, to me, he's raising questions about appearance,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So if I mark myself with these trappings of like what a quote unquote man is, you know, like man as far as like being a free individual, like, you know, I think that's like kind of the question that he's the simple question that he's raising, you know, and it's just through appearance, right? But it
Mm-hmm.
like that small act raises a lot of interesting questions. And like, can you convince people to consider the ways in which they think about the world, and can those viewpoints change? Or, you know, like can seeing, or, you know, like can hearing what Douglas is trying to say through making photographs of himself, yeah, can that kind of like like does that engender, you know, like some sort of like personal, like some change on like a personal level? Yeah, I don't know, I guess like I like I understand like that history, and I understand like like photography's use in that way, and it's all things that I consider. But for me, like I'm I try to make, I suppose, like I guess I just try to be genuine in the images that I make of other people. And, you know, I think that's like sort of finding that level of respect, and, you know, like, yeah, like, yeah, like creating the image where where that individual has dignity. Yeah, I think that's just that's sort of my aim going into that interaction. And so I remain hopeful that like that I'll always be able to do that, and then also remaining hopeful that like that my work can continue to just ask people questions and get people to think critically. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. I think it sums up the project really well. Zora J. Murff, thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. It was a really great pleasure speaking with you again, David.